Bom dia para quem é de bom dia, boa noite para quem é da boa noite, 93 para quem é de 93, paz profunda para quem é de paz profunda. Você está no Boteco dos Illuminatis e hoje a gente vai entregar, eu não sei nem como é que eu falo, eu estou até sem roupa para participar, porque nós vamos entrevistar o grão-neto do Bram Stoker, o cara que escreveu o Drácula e que hoje o neto dele, o legado dele, ele defende e está trabalhando para cuidar disso, né? Para cuidar de todas essas informações do legado do Bram. Então, para você entender, você precisa ativar as legendas e depois colocar Translate to Portuguese. And now I will speak in English. But before introducing our guests, the people from the Illuminati's pub from tonight, from the Enochian realms, Ulysses Massad.
Hello, guys. I'm glad to be here. I'm excited for this interview to meet Drake.
And from the Pagan Connection, André Correia.
Hello, everybody. I'm very excited to receive Dacre here. I'm a big fan of his book, and I'm very happy to talk and hear here now.
And also from the Pagan Connection, Vanessa Lanaro. Sorry, Vanessa, you have to be co-host.
Okay, now. Okay, I'm very glad and happy to be here with you guys. It's gonna be a great night for us.
Yeah, Rodrigo Lutark is with us, but he does not speak English, so he escaped for now. But from Japan, Robson Belli.
Hello, guys. It's an honor to stay here in this party. It's a Halloween party for us now.
And Fernando Guimarães, our astrologer, and I make you host.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Good evening, everyone. And it's an honor. I thank you, Mr. Stoker, to be here with us. And also for those who made the contact, thank you very much. And I'm Fernando from São Paulo. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Oh, Barbara will be joining us too. And last but not least, Lord Ja from the Red Vamp, or personal Brazilian vampire.
Yeah, hello, and good evening, my noble friends. It's great to meet you again, my noble friend, Dr. Stoker. It's great to have this time with all you here in Mayhem.
And our guest, Dacre Stoker. He was born in Montreal, Canada, was a physical education and science teacher for 22 years in Canada and the United States. He's the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker, author of the book Dracula. Dacre is also co-author of the Dracula Undead from 2009 and Dracula 2018, and he is also co-editor of the Lost Journal of Bram Stoker, the Dublin Tier, and together with his wife, he runs the Bram Stoker Estate. Welcome to our show, Dacre.
Thank you all in this Project Mayhem for having me here. This is a wonderful way to spend an evening as the season here in North America is cooling down as we're getting closer to Halloween. And as we know what happens there, the veil between the mortal world and the immortal world becomes very thin and the spirits connect with their relatives. And this is what I like to do, talk about Bram Stoker with all those interested people from around the world. So thank you for having me. I look forward to a wonderful discussion tonight.
Well, the first question that we always ask our guests is that, how did you get here? Because we, as you know, we interview mostly authors and people from the occult side and people from religious groups and things like that. So when they escaped from the normal world and came to the magic world, but you have the Stoker as your last name. How was it? Did you have a famous childhood? How was your life? How did you get into becoming the guy who is responsible for protecting the legacy of Bram Stoker?
Well, I'm sorry if I disappoint you. Many people think I live in some old castle with cobwebs and spiders ever since I was a little child, but you know, that's not true. You know, it was really, you know, very sort of normal. But to put it in perspective, Bram Stoker was one of 7 children, born and raised in Ireland. And of those 7 children, Bram had 1 son. One of the other brothers had a daughter, and then that family has died out. But then his youngest brother, my great-grandfather, had 2 children, 1 son and 1 daughter. The daughter never married, but the son traveled from Ireland over to Canada after World War I, looking to start a new life. And he did, and that's how my side of the family came. So it's strange when you think of 7 children, but only 2 now have active lines still alive. And Bram's line, his great-grandsons are still alive, 2 of them in their 80s, but they are not so interested. You would think they would be interested in Dracula, but their life was as a chartered accountant, you know, people that take care of taxes and all this other sort of boring money things. So the creative side, not so much, but they are very generous and they provide me with information that they had about Bram, either things that they were told by their Bram's son, their grandfather, or most importantly, boxes of letters, Bram's journal that I published in 2012. So my interest to all of this, how did I get here today as a best-selling author and the man, along with my wife, who helped lead the Bram Stoker estate, really started when I was in university. Before that, it was sports and girls, you know, and then after that in university, it was like, who is this man? First of all, my great-grandfather, who was a very famous doctor, incidentally. But as I learned more about him, I saw letters that we had between George Stoker and his brother Thornley and his brother Bram, the two important brothers who were involved in writing Dracula. So this started a lot of research. And I'm not sure if it was ever published in Brazil, but a book by 2 Boston College professors, McNally and Forescu, In Search of Dracula. If anybody in this panel have heard that, yeah, it was very early education about Vlad Dracula, about Bram Stoker's notes in the Rosenbach Museum. That's the first book that I read. And as a result of that, I became sort of the expert in the family, just purely out of interest and to write a paper at university. And then that part of my life settled down a little bit. I was too busy trying to be an Olympic athlete, then a coach. But then not till 2003 did I get a phone call from a man who was looking for some help writing a book about Dracula. And it turned out to be this one here. That's the English cover, Dracula the Undead, the first book that I wrote in 2009. It was a continuation, a sequel of Dracula. And with that, my job was to introduce Bram Stoker as a character. And that caused me to do now even more research and really become the expert on what was Bram like as a person, how would he say things, how would he react to things, what was his internal system. And that caused me to travel to Ireland, go to Philadelphia to look at the notes, starting to broaden my horizon and meet a lot of people like you guys that are interested in the field of vampirism, who have read many other books, going to conferences, going on panels. And that was a very fast process in about 1 year to get my background to the point where I could actually contribute to writing a book with somebody. And of course, as we say, the rest is history. This book gets published within 5 years and it becomes an international bestseller, Dracula the Undead. And I'm very happy that it has been successful. It again continues Bram's story by using his notes and using thoughts and characters that he was going to use. And from then, I've just kept moving on, finding more things and writing more books. So with that, it's a good question you asked. Again, how did I get here and become this type of person? I think my personality hasn't changed too much, but I certainly have a much better knowledge of Bram Stoker's research, his writing, and what he thought about the occult, what he thought about spiritualism, what were some of his interests that are, of course, very, very similar to people that you're discussing and have been talking with, because the occult was a huge thing in the Victorian era when Bram Stoker was growing up. And that's what I began to understand is how big of a thing was it? What was the impact on his life? And what were the issues? You know, it was quite interesting that many people back in those days were not free to talk against organized religion, either Catholicism or Protestant Anglican. If they spoke about that, they would be, you know, shunned from society. Mind you, people then started secret societies like Order of the Golden Dawn, Freemasonry, the Hellfire Club. This is where they could discuss these things. This is where they could secretly go and open their minds. And I think Bram Stoker, I know he was a member of the Freemasons, and I know he attended some meetings of Golden Dawn, but I don't have any record of him being a member. But it was an opening of the minds, which was in Bram's mind and mine as well. It's a healthy thing. It's healthy for people to question and to look at things and wonder, especially when, if you look at history during the 1800s in England, the scientific process was just becoming popular. Charles Darwin had just discovered the origin of the species and wrote his book, and this was scaring religion. So it was a time of great turbulence, but Bram Stoker quietly wrote his notes, did a lot of research, wrote letters to some of these people, and his way of dealing with this was, as I say, sliding it into the book, not standing on a box yelling and screaming about something. He would subtly put it into stories. So I know that's a lot of talking at one time, but that gets the ball rolling for what I have come to understand is my role is to understand Bram better so I can help the world understand him and his positions better.
You said about the vampire. How did he get into the myth of the vampire? How was it at that time? Because here, if you're talking about Dracula, everyone knows who Dracula is. I believe just Superman, I think it's well known than Dracula. But at that time, what was a vampire to that people? And how did he got to know the myth to write about it?
Okay, so this is probably one of the most, you know, complex issues. So part of it is himself and his personal experience. As a young boy, he was a very sick young boy, very close to death for the first 7 years of his life. His mother told him horrifying stories, which was not as a penalty or a cautionary tale. It was to keep him entertained as a young boy. And as we were talking about different folklore in different countries, Ireland has some pretty horrific versions of their own vampires and creatures of the night that would take the life from the living if you didn't behave well. So Bram had some firsthand experience from his mother as a young, impressionable child, very ill himself, I think, wondering what would happen to him if he was actually buried prematurely, like the people in her story that she told him of the cholera epidemic, where she witnessed people being buried before they're dead and crawling out of the grave to come out of the dirt to try to survive. So that makes him very impressionable. But that's one little piece of this. I've got about 3 pieces here. The second piece is you have to realize that he didn't invent vampires in literature. This was John Polidori, who wrote the first book in English literature called The Vampire. And then later we have J. Malcolm Rymer, who wrote Varney the Vampire. And then we have fellow Irishman Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who writes Carmilla. So Bram's story really was the 4th in the line of Gothic stories of vampires. So he had some ideas of how people would think about these books, and they were quite popular. As a matter of fact, Polidori's The Vampire was turned into a stage play in France, in England, and Bram, who was very fond of the theater, would have known about this. It's nowhere in his notes, but he would have known this. So again, that's the second part, is personal experience. The story is out there already about vampires on stage and in books. But then we also have a very good understanding of the research now that Bram has done. He wanted to get things absolutely accurate. So the London Library, when he was a theater manager living in London, he went to this library, and they have discovered the 26 books that Bram Stoker listed at the end of his notes for Dracula. And let me tell you guys, it is incredible. There is a book by a medical doctor about mesmerism. So here's not some crazy man. This is a medical doctor who writes about mesmerism. So we now know that that was a expanding science at the time. People were beginning to believe that Joseph Mesmer and Charcot were beginning, maybe they had some right ideas. So this book also had chapters about vampirism, true ghosts, trance walk, somnambulism. This is how he gets the ideas of Lucy having a demonic possession of Count Dracula, the devil, and sends her on her walk. We have nightmares in the stories of Dracula, which is also a sign of demonic possession. So all of these things, as I said, it's a mixture of Bram's own personal experiences, the things that he knows people are interested in, and now we know the research that he found in books by one doctor, and also a Church of England priest was also writing about second sight, necromancy. The other world is spiritualism. So respected people of the church, of medicine, writing about things that they think is important for the new world to understand. So this is where you take all these things and put it together in sort of one big soup. And it's the Dracula soup that Bram Stoker created from these different things. There's one other piece. And we know of the real vampire scares of Middle Ages in Europe. And these were essentially contagious diseases that people didn't understand how they were spread from one person to another. And as these treaties appeared in these libraries, Bram Stoker had access to these many treaties that explained when the church would send out a priest, Dom Augustine Calmet, or send out somebody like Philip Rohr or Herrenberg to go and look at these regions where people are doing exhumations from the grave, taking the heart out and burning it and feeding the soup to save the people being taken by the vampire, when in fact all they didn't understand was how germs were passed on. And they were thinking superstition was answering the question when medicine or religion could not answer those questions. Superstition is what was telling people it's vampirism. And Bram Stoker goes to America in 1896, almost his last year of writing the novel. And he picks up a newspaper from the New York World and sees an article about vampires in the New England states of the US, in 5 of the states, that they had many cases of suspected vampirism where the state authorities allowed people to exhume the bodies, stick a stake in, and take the heart out and burn it at crossroads. So not only was he thinking this was medieval history that people in England, his readers, were being prepared for, but it was contemporary. It was modern life that was going on in America that Bram was like, oh yes, if they believe this is happening, and really what it was tuberculosis that was causing them to believe in this vampire superstition. So he had a lot of different things that he discovered that made it easier for him to write a book that made the vampire seem real. It wasn't some vampire story in a far off country like Carmilla in Austria. It was a story of a vampire coming to England that scared the heck out of all these people who were normally aware of, we are the most powerful country in the world. London is most powerful. But since they just experienced the first chink in the armor, the first thing that went wrong, the Jack the Ripper murders had happened while just before Bram Stoker started writing Dracula, and the police could not catch this man or men. So they were scared, they were on edge. Bram Stoker writes a story that brings in a supernatural creature that the police are not even called in to try to capture, because I think Bram Stoker knew that you need someone like Van Helsing who understands spiritualism, understands the supernatural. This is how you do battle with a count. You don't call in Scotland Yard or the Metropolitan Police. That didn't work for Jack the Ripper. So again, Bram was aware of what made everybody scared, what was the sticking points. So that's where he got his vampirism from, many different sources. He writes this book that was real, it felt real, it was in real places, and it was, as we say in English, real scary.
Well, that turns the story even more fascinating, even more fascinating. And then how was he publishing it? It was in 1895, 97, the first edition.
1897, yeah.
97,
so this
okay.
is the 125th anniversary this year, yeah.
Yes. And how many books was it published? Was it a huge success at the beginning? And how was his life after Dracula?
You know, that's a great question. We do know from his contract that 3,000 copies was the first printing.
That are worth a fortune today.
Yeah, it was. But the first 1,000 he didn't make much money on. It was part of the contract. The very beginning, the publisher was going to get back most of their money in the first 1,000. So here's the funny thing. The reviewers of Dracula at the beginning, the very beginning, there was negative outcry. This was too scary. The word they used back in the day, sensationalism. It's too crazy. It's too out there. It's not respecting, you know, modern religion and the way everybody was so conservative and, you know, they'd never. So there was some negative reaction to this book at the beginning by the very stuffy British press. The Americans loved it. They were much more freer. Their reviews were, oh, what a wonderful story. And to think Bram Stoker, our theater manager who comes over here, you think he could have done this. They couldn't imagine that the lovable, organized Bram Stoker who comes over to America with the Lyceum Theater and Henry Irving, the famous actor, could ever write such a story. So it's like he had a secret dark side that was released in the writing of this story. And I think there's something to that, you guys. I think the whole idea of Bram's interest in the occult and spiritualism was ignited by writing this book. So his life didn't change much at all because he still was the theater manager. That's where he made his money. And as a matter of fact, when he died in the year 1912, the book didn't have incredibly good sales. What happened, though, was he did have the sense to protect the dramatic rights of the story by having a reading, a staged reading at the Lyceum Theater. It wasn't a production. One script passed around to 11 different people on the stage, and they read it. And so he got his license to protect that dramatic rights. He died, and then his wife was able to, 12 years later, convince Hamilton Dean and John Balderston to help her turn this into a play, and she made some money that way. And when Raymond Huntley, who was the first Dracula, Edmund Burke, and then Bela Lugosi, that's when the story really got popular, and it went to England, it went to America, and the book started selling like crazy. Because just like anything else, if there's something visual, people want to go back to the book. And then, of course, in 1931, when Universal Films purchases the movie rights from Stoker and Dean and Balderston, from the playwrights, the sales really go up, and Bela Lugosi is, made like he's a hero because he's done such a wonderful job on stage, now on screen. So that's sort of what happened in Bram's life. And shortly after he died, his wife made good money, and she didn't have any problems living after all that, because that was very, very lucrative for her after all that.
You mentioned that he was a Freemason, and he talked to the people from the Golden Dawn. What information do you have about he and these orders? Because here we have interviewed several Freemasons. I am a Freemason, Ulysses, André, and we do love to interview people from. And this information, I think it's new, because I looked up in the Wikipedia and things about Bram, and it does not say that he was.
Exactly. And obviously I am not, so I don't have the secrets. But here's what I found out. But 2 years ago, I got to know a man living in my town here in South Carolina that was very high up in Freemasonry in America. And he said, Dacre, I think I read something somewhere about Bram Stoker being a Freemason. Let me do a little digging for you. And so he did, and he came back and he sent me an article in one of the magazines that looks back at people who were quite famous and who were Freemasons. And it mentioned the lodge that he was connected with in London. And I think it's called something like Chandos and Windos or something like this. It's not active, it's finished to this day, but it did say that he wasn't a particularly active member because he was so busy at the Lyceum Theater. I mean, this was all-consuming job for 27 years. And so there's very little written about what he really did behind the closed doors. But I do have this friend who I'm writing with, and we've done some comics, we're doing RPG games, and he is a Freemason. And he said, Dacre, don't be so quick. He said, when you start looking at Dracula, he said, there are some terms and phrases in this book that I will tell you right now are homage to Freemasonry. The way that the Count welcomed Jonathan Harker into the castle has that same sort of feeling. So I don't know the secrets, but it's verified now that I've seen the article. He's on the list. We just don't know what he did too much. But I feel good that he found a place, even if it was not such a big part of his life, that he could go and explore these things about life and brotherhood and how people have faith in one another and so on, that really, I think, rounded him out as a person while his life was so busy on the stage, which is like it's not a real life, as you guys know, television and movies and the stage, it's not real. You're acting, you're being something else. But when you could retreat to Freemasonry, you could be real with your people and think collectively.
Well, he would probably have given lots of lectures about the vampire myth and the Dracula and the stories. At least here in Brazil, we do have some Freemason lodges that are they specialize in occult, and since Brazil is a Catholic country, but highly spiritually country, so we do have lots of lodges that deal specific with Hermetics and Kabbalah and things like that. And in England at that time, we probably have several other lodges that were dealing with the occult, the Theosophy and the Golden Dawn too. What do you know about the Golden Dawn and Bram?
I only know from respected researcher who has showed me a list of people that attended some meetings of Golden Dawn, and Bram was on the list twice. That's all I know. I don't know where it was. somewhere in England. And I wish I knew more, but what I can say is some people have said, oh, he was a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn. What I know was he was very good friends with J. Brodie Innes, who was one of the guys who was moved over from Freemasonry to Golden Dawn. And Mr. J. Brodie Innes and Bram have wrote many letters back and forth. Nothing, I've read the letters. There's not like, oh, you should come to the next meeting. Oh, you need to become a member. But it was more of their interest in diablerie, in the devil, in its sort of its hold, its interest over people. And J. Brodie Innes actually wrote a book called The Devil's Mistress. And he dedicated the book to Bram Stoker. And he said, I dedicate this book to the author of Dracula, whom I am not allowed. It was something like this, who he couldn't tell why. He said he couldn't tell why he's dedicating the book. In other words, it was a secret reference in the front of the book. I'm not at liberty to say more. So Mr. Innes left some little puzzle in reference to Bram Stoker in this book, The Devil's Mistress. And that's something that I need to continue to explore at some point. I think it's very cool. I just don't know too much about it.
Fernando?
I would like to ask a question to Mr. Stoker, please. Is there any connection of the name, the word and name Dracula, or is a translation of dragon, or more specific, the Order of the Dragon?
Yes. So this is what I know, having now traveled to Transylvania 12 times, some of those on recreation, some of them on very serious research and meeting scholars and interested people like yourselves. The language in Wallachia, Transylvania, was changing a lot as the borders were between Hungary, Germany, Romania. So that's why to this day we have this name Dracula, that means Order of the Dragon or Devil. They're interchangeable because of these languages. Where Bram Stoker found that was in two books. One of them by William Wilkinson, who wrote a book called The Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia. And in it, it said the name Dracula means devil. It didn't say dragon because obviously Mr. Wilkinson didn't know the second part. Then the other book was by a lawyer, James Samuelson from London, called Transylvania, Its Products and Its People. That mentioned Vlad Dracula the Impaler, Vlad Dracula III, and he said he was a horrendous warrior, bloodthirsty, all these terrible things he did. Didn't mention dragon, but mentioned he was known as the devil. So those are the only two books in all these references in Bram Stoker's library that he had and in the London library. And I am convinced that when Bram Stoker found those, he didn't find them by chance. He very specifically went to that library in Whitby one day, and he specifically studied at the London Library for 4 years. He was looking for a devil. I think the image of the devil was cast upon him by Henry Irving, playing the role of Mephistopheles on stage.
Oh, okay.
And I have seen posters of the playbills of Mephistopheles in Lyceum Theater, and it's perfect. So I think he was looking at the devil incarnate, and he needed a real person to give him some mortal backstory life, to make him a little more believable than just this creature is the devil. It's the creature is the devil incarnate coming from Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracula. So those are the connections. That's a great question. That's what I know from Bram's notes and the books in the library.
Yeah, because it seems that the Order of the Dragon were a compound of noble knights that, you know, from the elite of the time that was protecting somehow, like the, you know, protecting the cross, or, you know, like the stories that we have of Templars.
Exactly. They, you know, this was Vlad's father was a member of the Order of the Dragon, put on started by King Sigismund of Luxembourg. And if you are Dracul, Order of Dracul, and you are the son of one of these, they put the A at the end, Dracula, son of. So yeah, it's interesting. If they were not looked at being devils, they were looking at being mighty dragon. And some of my Transylvanian friends thought, okay, if they're going to defend Christianity against the Ottomans, then why not take on this image of, you know, the strong supernatural devil as a dragon, which could make their name even more scarier, you know, as sometimes this does when, at least in America, you know, they write on the side of airplanes, you know, the devil dog, you know, something scary to make your opponent really scared. That's just my theory. I'm not really sure.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. We got some more questions now.
Hi, Drake. Is there any inspiration in Elizabeth Bathory to and because you say about the Vlad the Impaler, but and about Elizabeth Bathory, what can you say about?
She is such a perfect historical figure who either, we don't know for sure if it was political or if she really did drain the blood of all these young girls and drink the blood or bathe in the blood. It's a murky time, but what we know is history judges her as a very cruel person, a very cruel lady who has as much claim as Vlad the Impaler of being bloodthirsty, even if they weren't technically a vampire. So what did Bram Stoker know, if anything, about her? Well, sadly, all those 26 books in the London Library that I have looked at, none of them had anything about Bathory. And it was like, I wanted to see it so badly because, as you know, Ian Holt and I did our research and we thought, okay, when we were doing this book, Dracula the Undead, if we're going to bring back Count Dracula, who I challenged many people when they said, oh, why, how could you write a sequel? Dracula's dead. How did he die? It was a Bowie knife and a kukri blade. It didn't even cut the head off, and there was no wooden stake. So he crumbled into dust. He escaped. Okay, so that gives me my opening. And Ian and I decided, just as you asked, let's bring back, or let's introduce to the modern Dracula myth this relationship, or, you know, contentious relationship between Elizabeth Bathory and Count Dracula. Let's create a backstory that's interesting because she does have the history of blood bathing and it would be believable. People want it. So the sad thing is, if Bram had even put her name in the notes, I could have said that came from Bram, but it didn't. It came from the history books that myself and Ian Holt and Alexander Gallant, our researcher, we found it. You guys have all found it. Everybody knows about it. And I think she was a damn good character for us to use. And I know people that will go on a pilgrimage to see her castle and just love to, you know, think of her life and you know, tormented life that she had, as well as what she did to her victims. So great question. But if I find anything about Bram knowing her, I'll let you know.
Great. Lord?
Thank you.
Okay, we have another question here. Yes,
Yes.
my noble lord.
Yeah, my noble friend. It's great to hear you speaking about Bram Stoker, about Dracula and blood. It's always a great time. And my friend, I have a question. So, a great writer called Mary Shelley wrote the Frankenstein, the modern Prometheus. And after our talks in the last years, I read again Dracula. And then when I was reading Dracula again, something occurred to my mind. Dracula, the modern, the modern Morpheus, maybe. I know that Bram Stoker was fascinated by um, sleep paralysis, lucid dreams, and yes, have a great charge of ideas about dreams, about nightmares. And may you talk for us about this part of creative process of Bram Stoker?
It's a really good question. Partly, well, we don't know how much. We do know that Bram's older brother, Sir William Thornley Stoker, was a doctor. And this doctor was very famous. He was the head of the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland. He was very interested in the mental aspects of health, as well as the physical aspects of health. And in fact, he worked in two different hospitals. One of them was the Richmond Hospital. The other was the same hospital that Jonathan Swift, the writer of Gulliver's Travels, who did go insane and left all of his fortune to this hospital to become Swift's Hospital, to treat people with mental problems better. So you have the early days of medicine in Ireland. We say early, they were just starting to do surgery. They were starting to think about how to properly approach people with mental problems. And all of this stuff, I know, weighed very heavily on Bram. He considered all these issues. And one more little subtle thing before I get back to the rest of your question. When you talked about Frankenstein and how some of that information is applicable to Dracula, it comes from his brother. What his brother was doing with brain surgery on Renfield in chapter 21, this surgery where they put holes in the head to take the blood out. This was a time in medical history in London and in Dublin, Ireland, where they were doing experiments on animals, monkeys and dogs in particular, where they would take off the skull and look at the brain and touch the brain in places to see what was happening with different parts of the body. For medical science, this was necessary, but this was torture to these animals. There was no anesthesia. There was nothing to prevent infections. These creatures would usually die fairly close soon after, and sometimes they were kept alive, which was even more torturous. Bram Stoker's brother became an inspector of the people that wanted to perform these torturous surgeries or experiments in front of the big classrooms of students. It was called Inspector of Vivisection. So when I started reading Dracula yet again, I noticed all these references to Count Dracula as an evil experimenter who was doing experimenting on people. He was essentially experimenting on Renfield by putting ideas into his head to eat the bugs. And this is what Van Helsing was thinking Count Dracula was doing when he came to London. This was one of the sort of what we say the hot topics of the time, that Dracula was one of these bad criminal minds that was coming to not just take blood from people, but doing what these doctors were doing, that were going into court and some of them going into jail. So, you ask, what were the issues that Bram was getting at with Dracula, and how similar was this to Mary Shelley and her concern about body parts and human cloning and all this sort of thing. Dracula was very similar. So it's a wonderful observation that you made, a little more subtle, but that was a big concern of the time, of somebody with this power to exercise control over people's minds with hypnotism and mesmerism. What could they do to them physically?
Amazing, my noble friend. It's great to hear all this and this refresh my ideas and dreams about this amazing book from Bram.
Let me say one more thing, because you asked about the dreams. I'm sorry, I forgot that.
Oh.
There are bad dreams for those who sleep unwisely. One of the best lines in, and I know from my cousins whose grandfather told them that Bram Stoker did suffer from bad dreams in his life. And I think it goes back to the childhood stories, the nightmares that he had. And I also know, and I'm sure you guys do too, that back in the Victorian era, when somebody was resting and at sleep, if they had a bad dream, this was a sign of demonic possession of their mind and their soul, because they could not hold them off. So that's why people would have a cross by their bed, and so if you look at Dracula and you see how many times Bram mentions, oh, sleep well, sleep peacefully, I wish you have a peaceful sleep. That's so that the devil won't get inside your head, like Count Dracula.
Amazing. This is a great reference and one of my favorite sentences on that book. It's truly amazing. It's truly amazing. I think Marcelo, we have more questions. Now
we have a question from the chat. Dacre, in the book, we have the brides of Dracula, and then he fell in love with Mina. And was there something about the how would I say, the society at that time? I would say that Dracula has several wives in Wallachia, and then he abandoned them from Mina. How was this relationship? Is there anything best then? And then I will ask you again if you touch this issue in your book. But I believe this is the last question about the old Dracula, because I want to talk to you about your book, Dracula the Undead.
Okay. So one of the important things of the novel Dracula is that it has become a classic because it is, as we say, a microscope looking into society at the time. What were the issues that we can learn about the novel, about society from the novel? And one of them is the role of the female in society. We know that most of all, at this point, females were essentially there to look beautiful, to get married, and have babies. However, Bram Stoker made a big statement, and it comes honestly from his mother, who was a social activist herself. She raised 7 children, but she also delivered papers to an all-male statistical and social society in Dublin. That means she made them accept her to come in, and she told them all about how we should better educate people who were deaf and couldn't speak. She also delivered a paper on how we should judge if somebody was criminally insane. Most of the time, people that had mental problems, they had no day in court, just thrown into prison. And it was horrifying. No treatment, in prison. Later, asylums were starting to be built to try to take care of these people. So this was Bram's glimpse, and his mother was the modern woman who we see in Mina. We see Mina being smart. She is respected by the other men. She was the only lady at the time that could use a typewriter. She was the lady that took all the notes from Dr. Seward and Van Helsing, in triplicate, because of this new type of copying paper, would write down all the notes from everybody else and distribute them so that all the men could look good. And they could read the notes and go, oh, yes, we now understand what's happening. There's a vampire here. Up until that point, until Mina is the organizer, that they are running around not knowing what to do. The other thing, and I have to pay homage to my author friend, Robert 18 Basang, he said, there's one other amazing thing about Mina. She shows great mercy, which is very godlike, on Count Dracula, on the devil, at the end of the story when they're going to go and kill him. She says, be merciful, be gentle. Now, you have to realize it's not because she loved this guy. That's only in the 92 Coppola movie and some of the other books that there was a love story between Mina and Count Dracula. She showed mercy to Count Dracula in Bram Stoker's novel. That's why she respected him. It was only in other stories that there was a love story going on. And that brings into your other part of the question. Where do we find these other brides? These ladies, these three brides of Dracula, or are they the sisters? Who are they? We really don't know what their role is. That's ambiguous. We also know that there's a potential fourth other bride that was involved in the story Dracula's Guest, which was once part of the novel Dracula or the typescript Dracula. So there was potentially 4 women in his life that he obviously exchanged blood with from time to time, but he had to keep care of them in his castle. And they're the ones obviously that got to take some of the blood from Jonathan Harker. Mm-hmm. So all I can say about Bram making a statement is he identifies the modern woman, the hardworking Mina, who gets married after she has one suitor, a lawyer. But he makes a bit of a statement about Lucy, doesn't he? Who's had in one day, I've had 3 different lovers or 3 different suitors that want to marry me. Oh, what a difficult problem that is. So I think he's kind of poking fun at, if that's the biggest problem you've got, lady, in your life, you're going to be the first to die in my story, because I don't think he values that very highly. You know, Lucy is, yeah, she's a poor little rich girl that her biggest problem is, who am I going to marry? So that's my answer. I think Bram was a feminist and he was making a statement, and I think it was a good statement for the time.
That's great. And now I would like to talk about Dracula, the Undead, because that's a heavy burden. Because not only you're a descendant of Bram, and you're writing about Dracula. This is like, I don't know, like the grandson of the guy who created Superman has to write a story about Superman, and it's official. And then you have all the eyes of the world into you and your work. How was that? How was the process to write a continuation of one of the most famous stories in our literature?
Well, I realized maybe a little bit too late. The book was published. You know, it took us 5 years to write this because both of us had other jobs. And so we could do a little bit here, stop and go, stop and go. I didn't quite understand during that 5 years of research and writing the reaction from people in the world for me as a family member to have the courage or the nerve to continue a story that means so much to them. So it was shocking, really, when I started looking at not the previews, the professional previews and reviews were very good, but the general fan started looking at this and going, oh, how can you change this? How can you bring back Dracula? What is your rationale for this? Why is Dr. Seward become a morphine addict? This is crazy. He never would have done that if Bram wrote it. So there was obvious reasons why Ian Holt and I decided we're going to look at this story and say, okay, 25 years after Bram Stories ends, what is reasonable for these people to be doing? Don't you think they would be very upset that, number one, they had to kill Lucy? Number two, their friend Morris died. Number three, these three men who were all wanting to marry Lucy, now they don't have anyone. Number four, John Seward, who, like many doctors, starts using morphine when they shouldn't. And then Jonathan Harker, after his young wife, had a blood exchange with Count Dracula. What is she going to be like? Bram never really established rules in Dracula about how much blood goes in, how much blood comes out before you begin to begin a partial change into a vampire yourself. So all of those questions, Ian, Holt, and I decided we need to resolve them somehow. Some people won't like it. Some people will like it. When we wrote the story the way we did, it gave me pleasure, but I was scared that the child that was born at the end of Dracula is now a young man of 25 years old. Any child at that age is going to look back and go, what happened? You find out secrets of your parents that you don't always want public, and he wanted to know. So that's the story part. The reaction part, when our agent took this to the big publishers, we realized that my name and the reputation of the family got us into the meeting. So we say in English, it opened the door. But if they didn't like it, that door is going to close very quickly, because just as you said, there's high expectations from a family member. And if you're a Stoker and you don't write and research well, close to even what Bram Stoker did, which was a classic, that's a lot of responsibility. So we went over this book many times to clean it up and to fix it and change little things here and there. But at the same time, we wanted to keep it not so heavy. We wanted to make it easy to read, because back in Bram's day, people were expected different things from books than they do from this day. Nowadays, people whose intelligence level, I think, is a little bit lower, or they like to read books that aren't difficult to read. You can just read them easily. So we did get some negative reviews at the beginning. And I'm happy to say, though, which I think is ironic, after the first 2 or 3 years, people took a second read at Dracula the Undead. And I think what bothered people was the fact that our publisher called it a sequel. If you call a book a sequel to a classic, then you better not change anything. And right off the bat, we didn't write the story in the epistolary style because we just weren't good enough writers. So that was the first change. And then what we both thought was, we've got to put Bram Stoker in the story to make it interesting. And I know some fellow authors said, how could he call it a sequel if the original author is in the story? That's ridiculous. And that gave us some bad reviews. But since then, what used to be a 3-star review in Amazon, which I hate to say it, we authors do look at from time to time, it's now 4.5 stars, because more people have said, this is pretty good after all. I think the negative backlash of, is this a Stoker family member just trying to make money off of his family name, or did he really write a good story with good research? And I really think that's what it is now. People realize, hey, this may not be a classic, but it's a good story. I enjoy it. Even though the characters have changed, it's believable and it's fun. So that's Dracula the Undead in a short version there.
All right.
Dacre, in your book, you bring Bram and the vampire face to face in the Dracula. How was to create the world where the fictions merge with reality?
Oh, no, before that, tell us a little bit about Dracula. first. and
Okay, yeah,
then-
that's, I was just going to say, I think let's hold that question just for a sec, because
Okay.
with our time we've got, so is there any more questions of Dracula the Undead? And let me ask this of all of you. I'm going to turn the table for a moment. I don't know how many of you read it, but the ending of Dracula with no stake and the way the story ended is ambiguous. Yeah?
Yes.
It's not for certain what happens. If any of you read Dracula the Undead, we tried to do the same thing with the ending of our story. Any of you have any comment or question on what we did at the ending of our story, or how we set up for a potential sequel? So let's go there before we go Dracula.
All right.
I'm waiting. Somebody's got to answer before I get back into this.
André, he's the one who got it.
What do you think?
Sorry, I don't understand the end of
Okay,
the question.
The question is, what's your impression of the similarity between Bram Stoker's ending of Dracula and how Ian Holt and I ended Dracula the Undead with this potential question? Is Dracula still alive at the end of both stories?
It's a homage. I would do the same. It's a great idea, I think.
I think the both they led to us to understand what happened. I like this because it's an open question.
Yes.
We have a finish, but it's an open question. We can imagine what more interesting to us. I don't know if it is this right.
No, look, there's no right answer, because it was
okay.
What's your impression? So I for one agree, because that's what we wanted to do. Having been a teacher
Okay.
for 25 years and a coach, I like to ask questions of students that make them think without giving them the answer. And this is what we wanted to do. And I think Bram did the same thing. He didn't want to just spoon feed you the answer. Oh, Dracula's killed, the story's over. We want people to keep thinking about the story when you close it and go to bed at night, and you wonder, God, if that crate at the end of the Undead went onto the ship, the Titanic, and we know what happened to the Titanic, it went down. What could happen to the vampire and Mina when it goes down? And then where is Quincy? Is he saved? So that was this potential. And I'll tell you this, Ian Holt and I have a continuation planned. I don't know if we'll ever write it. But this is crazy. 2 days ago, I was giving a talk in Kentucky in the US, in a town called Bowling Green, Kentucky. 2 weeks before I was there, a man called David Ballard was giving a lecture. David Ballard is the man in charge of the expedition that discovered the Titanic. He was the one that had raised all the money to take the submarine down way back in 1985 and found those original pictures of the Titanic. That is exactly what Ian Holt and I were thinking of as a continuation. What about when David Ballard went down there and started bringing things up? Frozen in time underwater. Vampires don't necessarily die if they're in a crate in their own soil. Maybe they come up and get shipped off to a warehouse in New York. And we have now Bram Dracula in 1985. And you know what drove me crazy? How many of you saw the BBC Netflix co-production of Dracula in 2020 with
Dracula
Claes Bang?
I've seen it. I don't believe Dracula would survive the 20th century. Things are too much crazy now.
It's crazy, but he did the same thing with the time jump from the shipwreck in Whitby under the ocean, and he comes back. I thought, holy geez, he took my idea. I'm too late. But then maybe I said, oh, if Mark Gaddis and Stephen Moffat think that's a cool idea, that's an homage to my idea. So anyway, back to this. I'm glad, Andre, you like that. That was the whole idea. Keep people guessing. Don't give them all the answers. So, yeah.
Marcelo?
Yes. You showed us before we start recording a new book. So it's time. Tell us a little bit about this Dracula new book.
Okay. So this is Dracula, annotated for the 125th anniversary. So what this is it's Bram's story, but I'm going to show you a couple of cool pages, because you see this, the dark. Okay, we call that in English grayscale. Here's another. Okay. So this is about 3 books in one. Everything that is in grayscale here, there's 30,000 words in grayscale in this book, because I had a first edition Dracula that my cousins lent me, that Bram Stoker had to do with pencil, all this, to cut out these 30,000 words to make the first abridged edition of Dracula in 1901. So abridged means you've got to cut out some complicated things, maybe some sexual things, make it an easier read to sell as a cheap paperback in 1901. And many people haven't been able to get this book because they're long gone. They were inexpensive books that just disappeared. So what we did was, since I had the book that had all of Bram's writing crossing out, we went through a regular Dracula and did this. So you have both the real edition and you can see what he cut out. We also, the guy that I wrote this with, Robert Bissang, we're one of 6 people who have been able to look at the Dracula typescript. The Dracula typescript is owned by the Paul Allen estate. And what we did was anything that was crossed out of the Dracula typescript, we put back in. So as Bram Stoker gave all these pages to his publisher, they sat down and said, oh, no, that's got to come out. Cross it out. There was many, many things crossed out. We've put them back in and we underlined them. So you can see all the original thoughts that Bram was thinking about while he was writing the story. So for instance, look at this page.
Right.
You see a couple things that have an underline. Okay, right up here. So those things crossed out, you can see, we don't know if his editor or his self crossed them out, but they're back in. We also put in all the little notes that him or his brother wrote in the margins of the typescript. Like, for instance, his brother made comments correcting Bram when somebody was getting a blood transfusion. He said, no, this person must be lying down, not sitting up during this. Or when the type of knives that they were using for, remember they were cutting Lucy's head off? Bram started using the wrong type of knife. His brother, the doctor, said, no, you must use this type of knife. So very, very interesting things. The last thing we did, which is, I think, the best part of it all, is we've reconstructed the missing 3 chapters from the book. The original typescript started on page 102. And between Robert Bissang and myself, we have figured out that the very first chapter of Dracula was not Dracula's guest. That's chapter 2. It's a series of letters between all the characters. So one of the biggest complaints that people have about Dracula is that Bram Stoker wrote a story with Lucy as a friend of Mina's as a child, and Seward and Morris and Holmwood used to do things together, and we don't really know what they were doing. Bram had planned to have many letters back and forth between these people, building the relationship. So when we start reading chapter 3 and 4 and 5, all the way to 27, we understand where all those relationships started. This is exactly the same thing that Bram Stoker did as a theater manager. He would write hundreds of letters to people getting ready to put on a play, people to set design, actors, costumes, all this. The second chapter is Dracula's Guest. And it's, if you've never read it, it's a wonderful short story. You can get all of these things, not this book, but you can get all of Bram's stories for free at bramstoker.org. And you can read in English Dracula's Guest there. The third chapter that we recreated from Bram Stoker's notes was two things happened that he referenced. The character that we know as Jonathan Harker that suffered in Dracula's Guest went to the Munich dead house, which is the mortuary, where they used to lay out the bodies for 3 days before they'd put them in the ground so nobody would be buried prematurely, with wonderful flowers to make the smell go away. In his notes, he mentioned that Jonathan Harker recognized somebody that looked like the Count on the bier, on the bed, the dead place in the Munich dead house. And then later on, he went to the opera in Munich. And the opera was all about this mythical ship called the Flying Dutchman, which has this story that the ship is cursed and it can never come back to port. This was a famous play called Vanderkerker. Okay. And when I saw this, I go, oh, this is Bram Stoker foreshadowing the Demeter. The Demeter.
The Demeter,
So it's,
yes.
Exactly. So this makes total sense. Now, unfortunately, nobody has found the actual manuscript of those first 3 chapters. It's just the listing of all the letters. We have found the proper story of Dracula's Guest that his wife had published, and just references in the notes to Night at the Opera and the Munich Dead House. But it all makes sense. It is building up the story for Jonathan Harker to get on the train to go from Vienna to Klausenburg and Bistritza. But he's got some, now he's got some concerns in his mind because weird things happen.
This is the ultimate edition. Whoa.
It is. It's everything that comes together, the origin. And that's kind of why, and I know we've got a couple of minutes left, that's the whole idea of Dracula, the origin story of Bram Stoker's life and what was involved in his life to have him write Dracula. Now, obviously, it's a fictional story, but what caught my attention the most is if a little boy is deathly ill and can't stand upright until he's 7 years old, how in the name of God does he become a champion athlete at 17 years old at Trinity College? I figured there's got to be some kind of supernatural intervention.
Maybe that's the explanation, because your grandparents do not want to give interviews because they are 20-year-olds.
Yeah, that could be it. But seriously, I thought about this, and look, as an Olympic coach, I've seen steroid use, blood doping, all kinds of cheating in sport, and I figured they didn't have any of that stuff. No advanced medicine to make Bram Stoker have a miraculous recovery. So what about the nanny? When I found in the Trinity College archives that Ellen Crone really was their nanny, and she left in an envelope a big coil of her hair to Thornley Stoker. It's there today. It sits there. That I know that was a weird thing people in the Victorian era did. Yes. But it also makes a hell of a story when you think there was something more going on here than we know. So maybe there was some vampiric thing going on that made Bram become this athlete. But as we always know, you have to pay the piper sometimes. If you're going to take the juice, you got to make the work. And so later on in his life, when the vampire comes knocking, okay, we've saved you, young man, but it's now time to pay back. That was the original idea that I presented J.D. Barker. And I said, look, J.D., I've got all these weird things in his life, in Thornley's life, that his wife really did go insane. And all these other things that let me present you an outline and you help me write the story. He just thought, this is too cool. We knew that we could make this story feel as real as Dracula, that Bram Stoker would be given a purpose to write Dracula as if it's a warning to the world that vampires are real and you better be careful. And this story has really helped me because J.D. Barker is a very good writer. He's actually written now 2 books for James Patterson and become a New York Times bestseller. So I chose the right guy at the right time. And, you know, my reputation as a Stoker family member has gone up because of that. And people recognize this is a really good story. I think that's helped them turn around and go back to Dracula the Undead and take another look at it.
Yes, definitely. And can you tell us a little bit about the Bram Stoker estate? How can we find you? That's the question.
Well, okay. First of all, we run a website, my wife and I, bramstokerestate.com. Okay. What we try to do is promote and protect Bram Stoker's intellectual property. He's already, the rights to Dracula, it's all public domain. So we have nothing to do with that. But what we try to do is find his unpublished work and things that we think people would be interested about Bram. And his Lost Journal was one of them. When I found the Lost Journal and had it published in 2012, that's not public domain. So I helped his great-grandsons make some money because we published that. Sometimes people want to look at Bram's signature on products, like a nice pen. We helped them do that. And they gave my cousins a little bit of money. So it's not so much about making more money for them. They've all made a very good living, but it's trying to make sure that let's promote Bram Stoker to the point where people understand who he is, what he's like. And if you want to have me on a show like this to tell about him, or on a movie or on a documentary, I'll be glad to tell you the right things, because nothing makes me crazier than somebody say, oh, Bram Stoker died of this, or he was this, or he did this, without any evidence. You have to do the work. And I've done 12 years of work of reading all these letters and traveling all over the place and looking in museums to really find out what Bram Stoker was really all about, reading his stories and understanding them, traveling to places like Cruden Bay, Scotland, where he spent 14 summers, and who he spoke to there, what newspaper articles are about him, digging for things that aren't very sexy, but they're important piece of the puzzle. So people really can get an idea of who my famous relative was, rather than get wrong information. So that's really what the estate is. Not a big house like a castle. There's not thousands of dollars in it, but it's a vehicle to promote and protect Bram Stoker, and that's what we like to do.
Well, that was really great. It was a great evening. I think wonderful. You blow our minds out. It was great. But I have a final question before I wrap it out. What are your favorite vampires besides Dracula?
Ooh, the favorite ones. Okay.
It's a curiosity.
No, it is, because I spend so much time.
Because there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different vampires, and you spend all your time on Dracula. But
I know.
Favorite?
It's crazy. I like I like the Underworld series. And I even forget her name, the female that is Kate Beckinsale. I forget her name as the Dracula. I liked True Blood. I like that series with all those, lots of vampires there. The Anne Rice series, Lestat, he was pretty cool. That was good. I think also one of my favorites, have any of you guys seen the Steve Niles comic that was turned into a film, 30 Days of Night?
Yes.
With the vampires in Alaska. Yeah.
Great. A great comic book and a wonderful movie.
Yes. Danny Houston played the main vampire. Very scary, very horrendous. So yeah, other than Dracula, I think those are my big ones. Yeah. Now, before we go though, is there any other questions from anybody else? Because you and I have been chatting a lot, but anybody else have any questions before we go?
They were the one who wrote me the questions. Is that just because I speak English?
Good. Okay, good. Well,
but they were all participating here.
Good. Okay. Well, I'll just tell you this. It's obviously, this is my time of year. I'm going to Dublin, Ireland next week to be at since COVID, they stopped the Bram Stoker Festival, but now it's back again. So I'll be presenting one of my lectures there, but also I'll be talking about Nosferatu, which is a wonderful movie, even though it was a pirated version of Dracula. It's okay. We're comfortable with it. So I'm looking forward to a wonderful Halloween season, and I hope all of you are connecting with your spirits any way you can. Be careful and be safe, and thank you guys for having me so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Dacre. I will just, as I said, Ulysses Massad, your final words. I'll just call the guys to say goodbye to you.
Okay. Drake, it's a very nice interview. My mind is blowing with this information about the connection between brainstroke with Masonic. And your book, it looks crazy. It's very nice, a very great job. Thank you for this interview.
Thank you very much. Yeah, appreciate that.
Hobson Belly.
Thanks for all. It's the great lesson. It's the class of the vampire myth and other things about Dracula, Bram Stoker, and I really like the information about Bram Stoker and Freemason and the Golden Dawn. Is very, very information for the public at all. Thank you for all.
You're very welcome.
This interview is the most important for us because all of us read Dracula. All of us see the movies and see this work is awesome. Thank you for all. Thank you for today. Is the great. I do you book today. Dracula.
Okay.
In Portuguese. I don't know have your books in Portuguese. Now I book for book the poster in few days. Come to Japan. Your book in Portuguese.
Okay. Good.
Robson, it was published in Portuguese.
Yeah.
His books. Yeah, great. You know what publisher house that?
Planeta.
I'll get this information.
The second one is Planeta.
For the people who are
Yeah.
listening to us, I will put the link in the description of the video so you can buy it in Portuguese. And this new one, the Dracula, the Ultimate Series, it's going to be published in Portuguese.
This one.
Yeah.
It's just come out a week ago, so we haven't got any offers yet from other publishers, but we'll be working on it.
It will be, and when it will get published here, we will ask you to come to the show again and to
absolutely
interview you again. It has been a delightful night.
Let's do one more thing, which might be fun. If everybody can turn their camera on we could do a big screenshot to have a picture of everybody. Is that possible?
Okay, I will start video. Okay, you can start video. Because we do not do this live because of the subtitles. So there are just a few people. When we said we were going to interview you, there were like hundreds of people who but they do not speak English. So we
right. So they'll wait and look at the subtitles. Okay.
Yeah, they will be a lot of people in YouTube.
Awesome. Okay. Well, listen, guys, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being on the show. And Lord Jai, your last words, and Vanessa and Andrea say.
Oh, Marcelo and Dacre and all guys in Mayhem, it's always amazing to have a good conversation with all you. Dacre, it's always enchanting to hear from you about Bram Stoker, about Vlad III, and of course, Dracula. It's always amazing. And yes, me and my wife Chandra have plans for the next years to realize that tour with you around Romania. We have this plan very, very live. So you must wait for us.
Well, I know we were waiting for the Ukraine war to settle down a little bit before we go back. So it's not a good situation in the world. But now my friends who live in Romania say the refugee problem is not so bad. So we're thinking of starting our tours again in June of 2023. So if you ever want information, I can send you the website of my partners, experiencetransylvania.com. That's the company that runs the tours that I lead with them. So we'd love to have some of you guys come to see these cool castles and have good fun there, drinking good wine and enjoying it, telling good stories.
Yeah, we will.
Andre Correia,
final
word.
Thank you so much for being here with us. It's amazing. It was amazing to hear you and know all you say to us about Dracula, about the history of Bram. And I want to say that I love your book. Thank you for that. And I hope to talk with you soon here and Mayhem Project.
Well, Andrea, you know all the different ways to contact me because I'm going to miss all of your contacts in Messenger and say,
in mail.
You haven't forgotten, have you? So you know how to get a hold of me. So please do so.
Okay.
Well, don't worry, Dacre, you've got some new friends in Brazil. Whenever you want to come down here, we'll take you to the Umbanda temple, so you will see some ghosts, some real ghosts, and people incorporating and lots of strange Brazilian folklore.
Cool.
Take a trip to these things. You got now several friends in Brazil and Japan. If you ever want to go to Japan, you have friends there too.
Well, until we all meet again in the flesh, let's just say in the flesh.
All right. And thank you to join us in your show. And don't forget to join the channel, press the button. So YouTube is always kicking us because we do interviews that are the niche of the niche of the niche. And we do not follow the algorithm. So we have to ask people to find us. So this is the 380th interview. So 380 authors.
That's
from
cool.
the occult world and things like that. We even interviewed the people from the Ordo Saturni, that the guy from the Nosferatu, he was one of the issues or the protecting spirits of this secret society.
Oh, cool.
And we interviewed these guys. So
nice.
We interviewed Lord Dar and several other people. But your interview was great. We'd love to talk to people whose eyes shine when they talk about the people, the things that they love. And it was truly here. Ok. E para quem assistiu a gente, então, não esquece, segue o canal e a gente se vê aí no próximo Bate-Papo Mayhem.